We cannot comment on this matter as we are under a gag order. Further searches of the crime scene will be conducted tomorrow, and the area will be closed until those searches are complete. Can the murder of 13 people ever be justified if the goal was to prevent a catastrophe? Was this a schizophrenic killer who genuinely believed that by killing people he was saving humanity from destruction? Or just an ordinary monster faking madness to avoid punishment? I dug through newspaper archives and found a lot of interesting material. Let's work through it together. I saw a light above the confessional and a voice said, "This is the person who must be killed." Santa Cruz, USA. A coastal city that became known as the murder capital of America, or as District Attorney Peter Chang called it, Murderville. The name wasn't accidental. The city and its surroundings became the site of prolonged killings and mysterious disappearances of men and even more often women. Often, local police didn't always move quickly to stop each new wave of murders or disappearances, since investigations often dragged on for years. Operating in Santa Cruz were killers such as John Fraser, the Zodiac, Edmund Kemper, and Herbert Mullin. The last two were active simultaneously, which created additional difficulties for investigators. Cops mistakenly believed they were dealing with a single serial killer. I already covered Kemper in a previous episode, and for those who haven't seen it, I'll remind you at the end of this video. Today, as you requested, I'll tell you the story of serial killer Herbert Mullin. Herbert Mullin was born on April 18, 1947, in Salinas, California, but moved to a farming community outside San Francisco when he was 5 years old. His father, Martin William, was a World War II veteran. Martin often shared war memories with his son and taught him to use firearms. He was a strict but fair father. He never scolded his children without reason and never raised a hand against them. Marty wanted to raise Herbert to be tough and physically strong, trying to instill a love of sports. Overall, in the Mullin household, there was no place for violence against children. A perfectly normal family for those times. When they moved to Felton in Santa Cruz County, Herbert started school. At school, he was quite popular, had many friends, dated girls, excelled academically, and played on the football team. He's number 63 in this photo. In his senior year, Herbert genuinely fell in love with a girl named Loretta. They eventually got engaged. After finishing school in '65, Herbert went to college where he studied engineering and dreamed of following in his father's footsteps by joining the Army. But everything changed when his best friend, Dean Richardson, died in a motorcycle accident. Herbert was 18 at the time and couldn't cope with the loss. He started to unravel. First, he built a shrine to Dean near which he would spend several hours every day. Along with this, he became obsessed with the concept of reincarnation and the idea that his friend's death was part of a grand cosmic plan. This affected his life deeply. He dropped his engineering major and switched to philosophy. He also explored Eastern religions, tried various alternative lifestyles, practiced yoga, meditated, switched to a macrobiotic diet. At one point, he even decided to try becoming a priest. Meanwhile, Herbert began experimenting with drugs. It started with marijuana, offered to him by his school friend Jim Gianera. But Mullin moved quickly onto heavier substances, including LSD. I know that sounds like the name isn't right, but we're on YouTube and have to be careful. Anyway, experimenting with various substances permanently changed the direction of his life. In 1968, Mullin suspected he was gay and broke up with Loretta, telling her he had slept with a man. He dropped out of school and joined the hippie movement, actively opposing the Vietnam War. He even officially registered as a conscientious objector, citing freedom of thought and religious belief. His father, a World War II veteran, supported his son's decision and helped him write a letter to what you might call the draft board. The application was approved. The first symptoms of schizophrenia appeared when Mullin moved in with his sister, Patricia, who lived with her husband in Sebastopol. During one dinner, Herbert began mimicking every movement and word of Patricia's husband, a phenomenon known as echopraxia, typical of catatonic schizophrenia. That was how Mullin ended up in a psychiatric hospital for the first time. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia intensified by heavy drug use. Although his stay in the clinic was voluntary, he resisted doctors and refused treatment. After 6 weeks of treatment, he left the hospital. Doctors predicted his mental health would deteriorate. Mullin went to the family home in Santa Cruz, worked odd jobs to cover living expenses and his drug habit. Once, while under the influence of substances, he threatened a park ranger with a knife. The ranger had asked Mullin to leave the forest where he was camping in a tent, since camping was prohibited there. The ranger restrained him and handed him over to police. The officer reported what had happened and said in his opinion the guy was high, but he had no complaints against him and didn't press charges. So Mullin ended up in treatment again, this time not for schizophrenia, but as a precaution for drug dependency. This incident with the ranger offended him so deeply that he would remember it for the rest of his life. You'll understand why in a moment. For the third time, Mullin ended up in treatment in '69 when it became known he was hearing voices in his head. He had told this to a former supervisor at a job where Herbert had once worked. Herbert told him about the voices and simultaneously began verbally sexually harassing the man. The man didn't appreciate it, called 911, and reported everything he'd heard. Mullin ended up in a psychiatric hospital again, spending the next 2 months there. He received a new diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. Herbert permanently left the family home and moved into a hippie commune where, in his view, people would understand and accept him better. But even in that environment, people considered him strange and were even afraid of him. He periodically had run-ins with the law, either for possession of prohibited substances or for shoplifting to buy them. What's interesting is that he was perfectly capable of reading and understanding reality. He got by without any assistance. He communicated normally. He took care of himself. This complicated things later when establishing his sanity at trial. Over the following years, Mullin cycled in and out of psychiatric institutions and drug rehabilitation programs. In 1972, he attempted to enlist in the army, reportedly to stop the killings, through what he believed was an authorized method, but was rejected due to his psychiatric history. This triggered deep depression. Failed job searches also affected his mental state. He blamed his parents and his old school friend, Jim Gianera, the guy who had first offered him marijuana. If Jim had known who he was giving that joint to and what chain of events it would set in motion, he definitely wouldn't have done it. Mullin had completely lost it, and this time, without the help of the voices in his head. October 13, 1972. Herbert Mullin approached a homeless man named Lawrence White on the street and beat him to death with a baseball bat. The killing appeared motiveless to investigators. There was no robbery, no connection between the two men. The case went cold. A week later, Mullin killed Mary Guilfoyle. He offered her a ride, she accepted. He drove her to a remote area, stabbed her, and then disemboweled her. Her skeleton was found months later, November 2, 1972. Mullin walked into a Catholic church in Los Gatos during confession and stabbed the priest, Father Henri Tomei, multiple times, then continued to kick the body. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found nothing to explain why a confessional had become a murder scene. The killer had disappeared without a trace. January 25, 1973. Mullin set out to a neighborhood on the outskirts of Santa Cruz where his old school friend Jim Gianera had once lived. Jim wasn't there, but the current resident of the house, Kathy Francis, helpfully told him where to find Jim and gave him the address of the previous occupants. It turned out they had moved just down the same street. Herbert went to the given address, found his old friend, greeted him, and immediately accused him of ruining his life with that marijuana he'd offered him years ago. He pulled out a weapon, aimed it at his old friend, and pulled the trigger. Wounded Jim crawled into the house to warn his wife Joanna, who was in the shower on the second floor. Mullin followed him inside and shot the woman 5 times, and then added several stab wounds to her back. His rage didn't subside. It only intensified. He went back to Kathy Francis's house, the woman who had given him directions, and shot her and her 2 children. Damon was 4 years old. David was 9. A knife was used on both scenes as well. At both locations, Mullin wiped traces of his presence and collected spent casings. Detectives continued to interview people in the city of Yuba City, as both murdered families had previously lived there. According to City Police Lieutenant Charles Scherer, Kathy Francis, 29, and her sons David Hughes, 9, and Damon Francis, 4, were found shot and stabbed in their small home on Mr. Spot Road on Thursday evening. On Friday, James Ralph Gianera, 24, and his wife, Joanna, 21, were found shot in their apartment 5 miles away on West Drive. Since the victims were close friends and all died from small-caliber gunshots, law enforcement suspects the deaths are connected. Bullet fragments were sent to the lab today. Lab analysis has shown that the 5 victims were all shot with the same small-caliber weapon, confirming investigators' suspicion that the 5 deaths are linked. Authorities also announced this morning that the victims had been involved in drug transportation between Santa Cruz and the Marysville area. City police and the sheriff's office met to analyze all aspects of the mass killing, but established neither a motive nor any suspects. February 10, 1973. 2 weeks after the previous crime, 4 teenagers were hanging out in Cowell Redwood State Park in Santa Cruz, where they had set up a camp. Mullin stumbled upon the boys' tent and remembered the ranger who had once kicked him out of this same forest, the one he had threatened with a knife, remember? So he posed as a ranger and tried to force the boys out of the park. The teenagers demonstratively showed off a .22 caliber rifle they had with them and told him where to go. Mullin warned that he'd come back the next day to make sure they'd listened. They hadn't listened. The next day, Mullin returned, as promised. Robert Spector, 18, Brian Card, 19, David Oliker, 18, and Mark Dreibelbis, 15, were each shot in the head with a pistol. Mullin took their rifle for himself. We cannot comment on this matter as we are under a gag order. Further searches of the crime scene will be conducted tomorrow, and the area will be closed until those searches are complete. Mullin's final victim was 72-year-old Fred Perez. On February 13th, 3 days after the killings in the forest, Mullin parked near Fred's house and, without getting out of the car, aimed the same rifle he'd taken from the teenager's campsite and fired. Just like that. No interaction with the victim, no motive anyone could see. He simply killed him and calmly drove away. A neighbor named Joanna Sagana witnessed the killing. She memorized the killer's license plate and immediately called 911. Within 10 minutes, Mullin was stopped. He did not resist. He refused to give testimony but asked investigators to respect his civil rights. If it hadn't been for the alertness and testimony of that witness, there's no telling how long it would have taken police to track the killer. Up to that point, they didn't even have a concrete suspect. In 4 months, Herbert Mullin had taken the lives of 3 women and 10 men. He changed weapons freely: a baseball bat, knife, pistol, rifle. His first victims were random, the next he killed deliberately, then returned to random victims again. Police tried to link all the crimes but couldn't find a single motive. The only common element was a kind of killer's signature: excessive brutality. In almost every case except the killing of Fred Perez, Mullin inflicted far more damage on his victims than was necessary. The first victim was beaten repeatedly with a bat. Mary's body was not only stabbed but disemboweled. Father Tomei was stabbed and then kicked repeatedly even after death. Even when Mullin started using firearms, his victims received additional knife wounds on top of the gunshots. In his car, investigators found the pistol used to shoot the Gianeras and Kathy Francis and her children, and the teenagers in the forest. That's direct evidence. I don't see the point in listing all the circumstantial evidence. The main thing here is that despite all the evidence, both direct and circumstantial, Mullin refused to answer investigators' questions. Herbert Mullin was tried for 10 murders. Although he acknowledged his guilt, the court had to decide whether he had been legally sane. Prosecutors emphasized that his actions were premeditated, while the defense argued that his crimes were driven by delusions caused by schizophrenia. In August 1973, Mullin was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. In December of the same year, he was also charged with the murder of Father Henri. Mullin pleaded guilty and received another life sentence. He also confessed to the murders of Mary Guilfoyle and homeless man Lawrence White, the first 2 victims whose cases had not yet been solved. In prison, he firmly maintained his position, that he killed to save the world from earthquakes. Doctors once again diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Interesting facts. Fact 1. In prison, Mullin was housed in the cell next to Edmund Kemper. Kemper had no respect for Mullin and called his crimes pointless. He even invented his own behavior modification techniques. For example, he encouraged Mullin to be quiet by rewarding him with peanuts. Mullin had a habit of singing and disturbing people when someone was trying to watch TV. so I poured water on him to shut him up. Then, when he was a good boy, I gave him some peanuts. Herbie liked peanuts. It was effective because pretty soon he started asking permission to sing. That's what they call behavior modification therapy. Fact 2. Herbert Mullin had been planning to be released from prison this year, in 2025. He even had plans to study psychology at UC Santa Cruz and start a family. But things didn't work out as planned. He died on August 18, 2022, at the age of 75. In your opinion, was Mullin a schizophrenic serial killer who genuinely believed that by killing people, he was saving humanity from destruction? Or was he an ordinary monster who had it all calculated in advance and faked madness to avoid punishment, the way Ron DeFeo did, whom I covered in another episode? Write your thoughts in the comments, a reminder for those who haven't seen it. Here's the video on Kemper. It's very interesting and contains killer interviews that I translated into English. That's the story, folks. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.